right, so this is me, same person here. Been working kind of in this intersection of Java and web for the better part of 20 years, on web slightly longer than Java. So I'd say like 18 years of Java and like 20 plus years of web. And that's kind of always been interesting to me. And it's been like talking to people here, it seems like there are a lot of Java devs. Some are doing also front-end stuff or kind of full stack, and they're either kind of liking it or not liking it. I grew up multilingual, so I speak Finnish, Swedish, and English kind of more or less on the same level. So I don't know if that's kind of led me to also just enjoy working in different languages and on different platforms more than others perhaps are. But what we're going to talk about today is like, how do we leverage some of the kind of stuff that we're used to in the Java world with having type safety, helping us kind of build software in a sane way and move that to the web. So depending on when you kind of touched front-end stuff last, it might have been like very wild, wild west, like 10 years ago, or kind of very kind of enterprise software development-y that it's today. I work as the VP of Developer Relations at Backen. Even though I am on paper an executive, I spend a lot of time coding, more so than in spreadsheets, and come to events like this and talk to people. A lot of developer relations is, well, I like to think about it, you can't be in developer relations if you're not a developer first, because it's a lot about the empathy, understanding what are the actual problems that we're helping people solve. And I've done a lot of actual enterprise development, so I know a lot of the like actual pain that goes into building good software, and that's where we're trying to do. I would kind of classify myself as an all-around nerd. Not necessarily in the classic way. I'm not really into comics or fantasy or even like Star Wars or Star Trek, so I'm weird in that sense. But I take a lot of my geekery into what I do. So I take a very scientific approach to cooking, and I can geek out on like how to best do a dish over a whole weekend, or I can, like I have a whole spreadsheet of how many grams all of my backpacking gear weighs, so I can like optimize the least amount of gear I could go for like a 2-week trip in the backcountry. So there are a lot of different ways you can be a nerd, and I'm a nerd in most of those ways. All right, so like I said, I'm gonna try something new here. I haven't tried this before, so it can either like be nice or it can be not nice. And the instructions will kind of continue to be up here as we go along. But if you want to take advantage of the QR code, you can. And through this, we're going to be able to kind of ask questions. If you have any questions to me, I'll see them as they come in here. You can upvote other people's questions, and then we'll have a little bit of a poll here in the beginning, just so I can get a sense for who are we as a group, just so I can, when we get to the actual coding, I can maybe highlight different parts of that depending on what your background is. All right, so I can see people are in there. The thumbs are going, very good. So let's get to know each other a little bit. So if you were to describe yourself right now as a developer, like what type of developer are you? Are you a back-end developer, full stack developer, or primarily front-end developer? All right, we have like a pretty interesting actually to see like there's a lot of full stack developers, and it pretty well aligns with what I've just heard talking to people. A lot of people are expected to be full stack developers, even if your background is in Java. It's like, well, we also need you to build a front end now, so just figure it out. And that's not always helpful, but that's the way it is. All right, so we have a lot of back-end developers as well. Hopefully I'll try to kind of show how things work hands-on, and if you have questions, obviously, please ask, and I'll try to explain better how that works. Cool, all right, so languages, like what type of languages out of these are you kind of just comfortable working with? Not necessarily that you're like the biggest expert in all of this, but like what are you just comfortable working with in general? All right, very interesting. So we had, I think, 25 answers on the last one, and pretty much everyone is comfortable in Java. That makes sense given where we are, and pretty much the same in HTML. So that kind of supports the thinking that a lot of people, even if you are a Java developer, will at some point or another end up in a situation where you need to know a little bit of front-end stuff. Between JavaScript and TypeScript, we can see a lot more people are working or familiar with JavaScript. So when we go into TypeScript, it will feel very, very familiar to you. I don't think it'll scare anyone, hopefully. Good. All right, last one, and then we'll get going. So just understanding, what does the technology landscape look like when you're working? Are you working with Spring Boot, Quarkus, Micronaut, React, Angular, Vue, all of these others? Also very interesting to see here. All right, this is pretty aligned with what I might have expected. Oh, cool, there's one other person here who knows Lit from before. And one person doing Quarkus. Good, yeah, so what we're going to talk about today is using Spring Boot and Lit. I'll explain how Lit works. If you know React, you know Lit, you just don't know that you know Lit, basically. Good. All right, so imagine yourself in this situation. You are building this very trivial application. As a person with a first name, last name, and an address, you've built a little REST endpoint that you can use to get all those people to your front end. And then in your front end here, you're just mapping over that and returning a sub-template with the first name and last name and address for whatever reason. Like, it's a simple example. All right, all is well. The application runs in production. You're happy. And then comes Bob. Bob comes along. It's a Friday. He's really eager to go out with his friends, but he needs to just do a couple of quick fixes in his code. And for whatever he is doing, this whole first name and last name is just complicating things. So he's just going to go ahead and change that to be a single name. Who cares? Obviously, he fixes his code to kind of reflect that change, but he didn't know that we are also using that same data model somewhere else. And because we're going over this untyped REST endpoint, there's no kind of, unless we've been very kind of good at writing tests, checking that everything works, there's a big chance that something might break somewhere in an unexpected place. So it would be, so obviously, so he pushes into production. He goes out with his friends, has a good time, wakes up in the afternoon the next morning to a lot of angry messages from his boss because the app is broken in production and all of that stuff that you don't want to do. Obviously, there are probably better, hopefully they have some sort of like DevOps pipeline that catches this before then, but let's assume for the sake of the argument that there isn't. So when we're kind of working with Java, we're sort of just used to having this safety net of type checking. Like if we change something in our code that affects somebody else's code in our team or in our organization, the compiler will yell at us and say like, hey, you broke this thing here too, and like you need to do something about it before I let you even run this application. And what we're kind of thinking is like, wouldn't it be really good if that also extended through the entire stack, not just the backend? Now, if you're using, for instance, Angular with TypeScript or React, you're able to define types, but again, it can be difficult to keep these types in sync. So let's take a look at what we've created to kind of solve this problem. So we have this new framework called Hilla, which takes a standard Spring Boot backend, a TypeScript front end using Lit, and we're going to take a look at that hands-on in just a second. Applies just a teeny bit of magic to make these work really seamlessly together, and that way you get this very kind of nice developer experience. You get the benefit of using these battle-tested frameworks, but in a slightly more developer-friendly way. Specifically, to just kind of narrow down what we're trying to achieve here is we are specifically trying to help people build these more rich dynamic applications. So we're not as much focused on building like a dynamic website or like a web shop. You certainly can, but that's not really what we're optimizing for. And you can see that if you look at the library of components that we ship with this. So there are components for things like data grids and charts and multi-select combo boxes and date pickers and all of these things that allow you to build forms and data grids and kind of deal with business data. So this is kind of what we're trying to help. We try to make it easier to build complex software in a sense. And what Hilla is kind of in a nutshell is what it brings to the table in addition to these standard pieces that you already have is Java to TypeScript generation. So we want to make sure that those types stay in sync as you develop. As somebody else touches code, we want those to be in sync. We also help with validation in that we allow you to share the same validation on the server and in the client. So if you define validation constraints on a Java Pojo, you can use those in your UI form, and then the framework will, again, check those when it gets back to the server to make sure that things are the way they should be. We ship with a big library of UI components so that you have kind of the building blocks you need, and we make sure that those stay in sync with everything else in this package that we give you. And finally, we have an integrated build tooling. So you just start one Maven build that'll launch the front end, the back end. It will react to changes in either one and just automatically keep refreshing your browser as you're developing. So you have a really nice kind of integrated development experience. And this is an Apache 2 licensed open source project. So if you feel like you want to poke around and see how things are built, feel free to go and check out the GitHub repo and dig in. All right, so that gets us to the meat of the presentation. Let's actually jump into code and see how all of this works. And let me see here. We'll save the questions for a little bit later. So here I have a application, and I'm going to just start a build with Maven. So I'm using Maven in this project. It's a Spring Boot project, so we can take a look at what we have here while it's starting up. We have a POM file here. You can see I'm using Java 17, Spring Boot, and that's pretty much it. Maven is configured to use Spring Boot Run as its default target, so I could just write Maven and it started up. All right, so let's start by just looking at the basic kind of component model. So now we're talking about lit. So if you're familiar with React, this is very similar. You have a component that has a template, it has a state. Whenever the state changes, the template reflects. So we can first of all make sure that this works. So I can change something here and I can see that it reflects in my browser. Good. So the way that we can define state here, and what is going to be a little bit different here, is we're effectively building our own custom HTML element. We're not building a VDOM node of any kind. We're actually defining a new HTML node that the browser understands. So we'll take a look at that in a second, but we're creating a new HTML tag called HillaView. And we can define that this element has a property that's name. We can initialize that to empty and say that this should actually say hello name or default to world. So if we save it, nothing changes because name is empty. And of course, in TypeScript and JavaScript, empty is a null-ish value, which evaluates to false in this case, so we don't have to do like if name is empty or null or like all of that stuff. If I update something here, that will get reflected in the template, but that's obviously not very interesting in and of itself. What is sort of interesting is if we go into our browser dev tools, you can see, as I said, we have this HTML tag now that is called HillaView. So we're not kind of running in a virtualized environment of any kind. We're actually working with these elements. And since we have this property name, we can set it like we would for any other. So Chicago, like that, and it will reflect in the element. We can also do the same programmatically because it is a property. So we can say name is equal to foo, and that would also get reflected. So that's the basic kind of idea of a component model. It's very straightforward. You have a state and a template, and you always make sure that the template is kind of a function of that state. So whenever the state changes, we can update that. All right, so now that we have that, let's take a look at the backend, what we have. And what I want to build is just a simple CRUD view where we can show some entities that we have in the backend, and we can kind of work with them, filter them down, edit one, and so on. So let's open up the project again here and take a look at what we have here in the source main Java folder. So this is the Java part of the application. Here I have, first of all, some entities. I have a person class with a first name, last name, and email. I've defined a few just basic JavaX validations here. So saying like, I don't want these to be empty. The email should be a valid email. So kind of straightforward, reasonable things to expect from these values. So we don't want empty names and invalid emails. Good. I'm using an embedded H2 database and just a Spring Data configured JPA repository so that we have actually somewhere where we can save these and we can refresh our app and see that we were actually managed to save this data somewhere. It's not just saved in memory. All right, so that's the kind of backend that we have. I have a generator that generates just a little list of users for us to work with. So now we can start building the actual interesting part here. We can create a endpoint. And I'm going to call this a person endpoint. And conceptually, this is like your REST endpoint. And it doesn't even look all that different. So we will annotate this with a endpoint annotation. I'm also going to say that this should be anonymous allowed like this. So I'm not going to start setting up security for this application, but by default, it doesn't allow access to endpoints unless you specifically allow. All right, so in our endpoint, this is a Spring Bean, so we can do auto wiring. I'm going to take in that person repository, call it repo, because it's really hard to spell repository while you're talking. And we're going to save that into a field. All right, so now I'm going to define the API that I want to access from my client. So the first thing I want to have is just a way to fetch all of those. So essentially the find all. So I'll create a new method that returns a list, Java util list of person objects, and we'll call this find all like this, and just return whatever we get from the repo. So this isn't necessarily the most kind of realistic code, but it gives you the idea of how we would access our backend. You would most likely have a service layer in between, or however that might work. So now we have that. What I want to do then, because we have the state in our template, I want to create a state that holds people so that I can then use those in the template. For that, I'm going to use a different type of state. So property is essentially something that we expect to be able to get passed in from the outside, like we did in our developer tool, setting the name on the attribute or through there. Where a state is something that's internal to this component. So we'll say that we have a state called people, and this will be a person array that's initialized to an empty array. So what you may or may not have noticed there is that I was able to just import this person as if it existed, and it came from this generated folder. And we can see that it matches, the signature matches what we had in Java. So we didn't have to create that, and if we were to change person, that would also reflect in TypeScript. All right, so we have this state. What I want to do then is call the backend so I can actually populate that state. So for that, I'm going to use the web standard web component connected callback. Connected, or actually, I'm going to async method, connected callback. And this gets called whenever this gets added to the DOM. So if we remove it and re-add it for whatever reason we're navigating between views, it's going to get called every time. We're going to call super.connectedCallback to make sure that the view itself gets initialized. And then we can start calling our backend. Async here means that we're using async await, which is a feature in TypeScript that allows us to deal with asynchronous code in a more legible way. It's essentially similar to using promises or like completable futures in Java, just that it looks like more like just synchronous code, so it's very easy to reason about. So I'm going to say that this .people will be equal to, and then this await keyword, so essentially just this specific function will get kind of placed on a queue waiting for that to complete, and then it'll just pick up. So it doesn't block the thread. So we're going to await the person endpoint .find all. So you can see that I was able to, again, call this as if it was a method. Under the hood, it will go through REST and all kinds of stuff. But in this case, I could just import this and call it as if it's a method. And that has the benefit of me being able to see what is the API. I can explore it. I can see what are the parameters that this expects, in which order, what does it give me back. All of that is kind of available to me. So we have now people in an array, but we're not displaying them anywhere. So let's go into our template here and just see how we could do that. So I'll create, first of all, just an unordered list here. And what I'll do here is I'll create I will create a map. So I'll take this .people.map, and for each person, I will create a subtemplate. So I can return another piece of HTML here, and just a list item with that person's email. So p.email, and you can see that because we have type information, we can see what are the different things we could potentially show. Now, it would be cool if we could filter down this list. So let's use one of the Vaadin UI components. So I'll use a Vaadin text field like this. We'll give it a label of name, like that. And then what I'll do is I'll add a listener on it. So on input, so essentially on every keystroke, we want to run something. And what we want to run here is, I'll just inline this quickly here. And we just want to update the value here. So we'll set this name equal to the event target value, like this. I also want to bind the initial value of this to that name. All right, so hopefully if I type in here now, you'll see that it actually reflects up to that H1 because that's reflecting that state. All right, but what we wanted to do was be able to filter down this list, and this is kind of, again, a reactive UI programming thing. So we can create a getter, again, just working with standard TypeScript or JavaScript here, called filtered people, and create a regular expression. So I'll do a const reg exp that takes in the name. So a new regular expression that takes in the name, is case insensitive, and then returns this .people.filter. So we're going to filter over all the people and see if p.email matches that regular expression. Let's see if I got that right. And we can then, instead of using the source array here, we can use the filtered array like this. And if things work, again, here we can type in stuff. It updates the state, which will then get reflected here in our UI. Now, obviously, the unordered list is not like the most optimal way of kind of looking at different users here. So let's use one of our components, a Vaadin grid, essentially a data grid. So I'll do a Vaadin grid like this, and I'll bind the items array of that to our filtered people, like this. Within the grid, I'll define a few columns. So Vaadin grid column, and it will have a path property on it, and we'll have 3 of these. I'm using Emmet. If you're not familiar with it, that's just kind of a autocomplete language for HTML to save you from having to watch me type that live. So first name, last name, email, and what we have now is a data grid with all those people. And again, since that logic resides in our actual component, we can filter them down the same way as we could with the unordered list. All right, so what I want to do here in my little application is be able to select a person, display them in a form, edit them, and save them back to the server. So let's go ahead and first of all create a new form for us. Here I'm going to use a couple of CSS helpers that we ship with. I heard from a lot of people kind of talking in the conference that CSS is not like something that people enjoy working necessarily with. So if you're like, you can use standard CSS if you want, but if you don't, we have these helpers. So I'm going to say that I want to have a grid layout, so a CSS grid. Grid calls 2, so 2 columns with a medium gap between those columns, and items baseline. So I want them to be aligned to the baseline. And in here, we'll need fields for first name, last name, email, and a button for saving. So I'll create button text field with a label, and we'll have 2 of those, like that. First name, so that's the label here is just to help people understand what they're supposed to put in there. Last name, and we'll have the login email field, and the label here is email, and then finally we have a login button like this called save. And we can see that we have this form here. Now, it doesn't really make sense to show the form always, because right now we don't have anything to edit there. So we can, using this question mark, do a Boolean property on this saying hidden, using the CSS, or kind of, yeah, basic CSS essentially, saying that this should be hidden if there is no selected person. Obviously, we need to define that state somewhere. So let's go up here and create a new state. Selected, and this will be optional, so I add a question mark on it. So this may or may not be set, but it's going to be a person if it is set. All right, so now we don't have a person, so we don't have a form. Now, how do we get a person? How do we get a form? So we're going to listen to an event here on the grid for whenever the active item changes. We're going to capture that, and then we're going to use that to display the form. So let me create, first of all, a method here. I'll say active item changed. So we'll take in an event that is of type grid active item changed, and this is typed with the type of the item that we're getting from there. So we can say this dot selected is equal to the event details value, and we can see from our autocomplete that that's a person. And now if, oh yeah, obviously we need to actually go into our grid here and bind that event. So the dot here denotes that we're setting a property, and at means we're listening to an event. So we're saying this to active item changed like that. And then finally, we're going to bind the selected items on the grid. This is just purely for visual reasons to an array of the selected item like this. And if this works, we can now select a item. We can see the row gets highlighted. Well, not on this projector, but on my screen you can see the row getting highlighted, and the form is either getting shown or hidden. And obviously the next part of making this a functional application is how do we take that person that we now have selected, populate them to that form? How do we reuse those validations that we already defined? So for that, we have a concept of a binder. A binder you initialize by creating a new binder. You're saying that the context for this, like which element has this form. In our case, it's this. And then we give it a person model. Now, the person type here is, as we remember, just a type definition, whereas the model is more kind of full-featured. It features all of these validation rules that we defined as well. So when we have this binder, what we can do is, in our render method, pull out the instance of that model. So we gave it just kind of the definition of the model, and the binder itself will create an instance of that we can use. So we'll do a constant here, model, and we'll pull that out of this dot binder. If you're not familiar with the syntax, I'm essentially using object destructuring to pull out that value. So it would be the same as saying const model equal this dot binder dot model, like that. But this way I can pull out many values in one go. And when I have that value, I can go in here and say, use this field helper that we have and bind to model dot, and for the first one, first name, last name, and email like this. And I need to import this for it to work like that. So this will still not work because we're not telling the binder what is the thing that you're supposed to be bound to. And we can do this here. So if this dot selected is true, so we don't have to in TypeScript say the actual like is equal to true or not null or whatever, we can just say if this is a true-ish value, we want to say this dot binder dot read, this dot selected, and in other cases we're going to clear that. So else this dot binder dot clear. All right, so see if this works. Yep, I'm able to select people here, and you can see them getting displayed here. If I make something invalid, so if I empty out something or if I make an email invalid, that's going to show up here as a validation error. All right, so we have most of the parts of our simple CRUD here, and what we still need to do though is how do we send that back to the server? So for that, we go back into our Java code again and define a new method here. So this will be a public method, returns the updated person, and it's called save. Takes in a person like that and calls repo.save with that person. And again, most likely you would have some more logic involved here, not just saving it right to the database, but you get the idea. So with that, we can now create a save method, and this will again be a async method. Anytime we call the server, we want to use an async method. That way our UI doesn't get stuck waiting for the server to respond. We can handle a bunch of input while that's happening. So we can do async, save, and here we'll want to get the saved value back that you remember we say return from there. So we'll say const saved is equal to await this dot binder dot submit to, and then we'll call the person endpoint dot save like that. So that will, whenever this finishes, we will have a saved object, hopefully. We'll see if we do. So if we did manage to get a saved object back, what we want to do is update our state here. So we have this array of people. I don't want to go and refetch the entire array of people, so I'm going to change just that one updated person. Now the way change detection works here is it only looks at the instance that we have. So it wouldn't notice if I change a one item inside of the array. I need to swap out the entire array. So we're using essentially immutable data structures. The pattern for dealing with this in JavaScript or TypeScript looks like this. So this dot people is equal to this dot people dot map. So we map over the array, and that's going to return a new array. And we'll get each of the existing items from there, and then we'll do a little check. So if the existing ID is equal to the saved ID like this, we know we found the item that got updated. So in that case, we'll swap out that for the saved, and it should of course be a question mark, and this will be, and otherwise we'll save or return the existing one. So looks a little weird. What we're doing is we're just creating a new array where we update that one item. And let's see if this works. So if I change the value here, hit save, nothing happens because I forgot to actually hook up the button to do something. So again, @ for event listener, click is the event that we want, and this will be hooked up to this .save. Might as well also show some of the things that we've built into some of these components. So we could say theme is equal to primary if we wanted to make this button a little bit more kind of stand out. So we'll change something here, hit save. You can see that it got updated here in the grid And likewise, if we refresh this, we can see that it actually did go into the database. We're able to pull that up again. Cool, so we've done quite a lot. We can filter this down, and everything seems to work. So the final thing I wanted to show you is, since we have this cool reactive front end that just reacts to state changes, and on the Java side, we're starting to deal more and more with event-driven architectures. Things are just happening. Wouldn't it be really cool if all those changes could just flow all the way to the UI and we could deal with them directly? So, well, I think it would be cool, so let's do that. So we'll do a public method that returns a flux. If you're not familiar with a flux, it's essentially a data type that can return values over and over again, 0 to infinity times. So we'll return strings here. So flux of strings, and we'll call this get names, like this. And here we'll return a flux of, flux of just, and then we can just pick some values here. So let's pick some short names here just because it's easier to type. So Eula, we'll take Barry, and we'll take Gene. All right, 3 of them, and we'll delay the elements just so we have a chance to kind of see what's happening. If we just shot them off quick fire, we wouldn't really have time to react to them. And we'll do a duration of seconds, like that, in 2 seconds. So 2 seconds between each of these. So now that we have that exposed from the endpoint, we can go into our UI here, and again, on the connected callback, what do we want to do? So when we're expecting one value, it makes sense for us to wait that. We know that eventually we'll get value back from there. But in case of a flux, we know that it can return 100 times, 1,000 times, like we don't know how many times. So really, we want to just add a listener to it. So whenever something comes, we want to do something with it. So we'll do person endpoint again. We'll call get names, and we'll say on next. So whenever the next thing comes along, what do we want to do with it? So we know we're going to get a string that contains a name, and we're going to update that to our component state like this. And if things went well, hopefully they did. All right, what did I do here? Oh man, got almost through the whole thing without this breaking. Anyone see what I did wrong? All right, so we're returning the flux here. We're doing that. All right, let's restart this just in case before admitting that I did something wrong, I'll blame the tool, and then after that I'll look into what might be going on. Get names on next. Well, come on. You see what's wrong here, right? You do. I need to actually assign it to something. All right, there we go. So I was the problem all along, as expected. Anyway, what you could see here, let's restart this. You can hopefully see that as the name comes in, it gets updated to the component state, which of course is reflected in the heading, it's reflected in the field, it's reflected in the filtering that we have here. And that is all that I wanted to show on the code side of things. So let's, in the interest of keeping a schedule, let's go ahead. Here's the code if you want to check it out. Pretty much everything that we just had there. And then I can see that we have some questions here. So we'll wait for the phones to go down one more. Good. All right. So let's do some questions and perhaps answers. And again, if you have any more questions, feel free to ask those. So we have Srini asking me, how would you describe yourself as a developer? I would definitely say out of these 3 categories that we have, that I consider myself a full stack developer. I I very much enjoy working on browser technologies, but I also like to work in Java. And for me, it's more like the right tool for the right job. I very much enjoy working with the DOM when it's kind of called for, and when I'm working with Java on the back end, like I can just tap into this vast ecosystem of everything that's in the Java ecosystem. So that's how I would describe myself. All right, benefits of TypeScript over JavaScript. A good question. I think the main benefit is in the name itself. There's typing, so it will tell me when I'm doing something dumb. And as you saw from just me coding here, I do dumb stuff all the time. And I'm sure everyone else does dumb stuff all the time. So for instance, if you're working with async await, it's very easy to forget that await keyword. And then what you get back is a promise of the data type that you're waiting for. And TypeScript will immediately tell you, like, no, this is not what you're trying to do. So from what I've seen, like talking to developers in big companies building enterprise software, the vast majority of them have switched over to TypeScript in the past few years. So I would say that I don't know like the percentage, but the vast majority of kind of larger enterprise grade apps are built using TypeScript these days, because as you saw from our code, there wasn't all that much overhead for us where we had to like define the types. It was really just in that state definition where we said that this is going to be a person or a person array. All right, so it seems that one is very similar to a tool you used in the past, Infragistics, with some bootstrap thrown in. Is this a valid comparison? Fortunately, I'm not familiar with Infragistics to kind of give a good answer on that, but if you want to come up here afterwards and kind of show me what it looks like, I might be able to give you a better answer on that. As an executive, will you ever put down the keyboard? Good question. No. Like I said, as long as I work in the kind of developer relations area, I would say no, because it's needed for me to understand. Like, it'd be very hard for me to say, like, is this a good tool that solves the problem or not if I'm just looking at it from the outside. Whereas now like earlier versions, I try them out, like a new version comes out, I try it out, I go to the team and like, no, like we need to fix this and that for it to be good. I did work in sales for a little while when we were setting up our US operations, and I didn't have time to code back then and it was terrible. I wanted to code. I like coding, so I think right now I'm in a good place where I can kind of do both, but also be in a position where I can like bring that developer voice into our leadership team. All right, this project has both front and back end together in a single project. They also deployed as one entity or different projects in different ports. So right now they're deployed as one jar, just a single Spring Boot application that does everything. If you have strong opinions one way or another, like you would want to be able to deploy these separately, let us know. We're very kind of open to hearing how people would like to deploy these, but for now, this is the way we're doing it. The apps are stateless, so they're still very easy to kind of scale horizontally up and down and however you would like. Can you show the model in Backen this change, how TypeScript would help? I certainly can. Let me see. We have still a couple minutes here. So let's go into our, no, we're not going to print, wrong window, P. So we're going to go into person. No, wrong person, don't save. Person.java here, and let's do this. All right, maybe that worked. So hopefully now this will kind of blow up because model.firstname doesn't exist, like it's not a thing in our model. So if the proverbial Bob was changing our code late at night before heading out, he would have gotten, even if this is like in a different part of the project, he would have gotten a compile time message already before he even was able to deploy and kind of look at his own stuff. He would have noticed that, hey, something's not right here. Good. Oh, just keep getting more questions. This is working too good now. I like the concept of listening to events. How does that approach impact the full-scale web application? How many browsers listening to the API? Additionally, any failover strategies? So you're specifically talking to this Flux endpoint? Yeah? Yeah, you are. So under the hood, it creates a WebSocket that it uses for that communication. So whatever kind of limitations you would have with dealing with WebSockets is typically what you see. So again, we really try to avoid reinventing wheels wherever we can. So we're just kind of taking off-the-shelf things that we know have already worked for people and try to build a kind of easier way to use them. So certainly, like if you have a WebSocket, that means that there is a little piece of state that keeps that socket open. So it's not as scalable, but I think for the benefit of what you get from that, like it can be very kind of interactive, showing to people things happening as they happen in the backend. Good. Angular versus React. I personally, my mental model works better with React than Angular. Like Angular is a little maybe too prescriptive for me, but yeah, I don't like. I'm very open to different frameworks as it is. We're actually right now. I have, if you go into my GitHub, you'll see there are some Hilla plus React projects there too. So you can use React on the front end instead of Lit. We're going to make that a little bit more official. So realizing that a lot of folks already use React, they like React, they know React, they have React developers. Like again, in the kind of interest of not kind of reinventing wheels, like it makes all the sense in the world to add support for that. Do we have a concept of proactive updates in case updates from the users? Yeah, you can use Redux. You can use any kind of state management library here. You can do it yourself. So you could do like a optimistic update of the state and then roll it back if that were to fail. So in the TypeScript, since you're using async await, you would do a try catch, like try updating, revert that if it didn't work out. How do you implement the transport for the reactive under the hood? That was a WebSocket under the hood. I think it's socket.io is the actual project that we're using there. What was the I argument on the new regex instantiation? That's ignore case. So that way we can capture both uppercase and lowercase stuff. How does this help in a microservice where can this be deployed as individual service or an aggregate that as one application using model federation microservice? So yeah, this would probably be more of an aggregate thing that connects to different microservices under the hood and kind of aggregates data from wherever you have that in your organization. We have played around a little bit with like doing micro front ends. There are other challenges that you run into there. It's not impossible by any means, but there are some kind of challenges with different, like if you're completely different versions and you're trying to, everyone has their own, like if everyone were to bring their own button and their own grid and everything, that doesn't work very well. So you need to figure out a way of having like a shared set of kind of front-end assets to make that work in a good way. Any test framework that could be used? I would say your favorite front-end test frameworks work. So for web components specifically, web page test is a pretty good one, but you could use any others that you're familiar with. And of course, on the Java side, your JUnits and whatnot. Are you hiring? Not for my team. I do think we have a couple of engineer positions open. So if you go to vaughan.com/jobs, you'll see that. And I think we already answered this. So I think we got through all of them. Thank you so much. I think that actually worked out better than I thought, because that way you can actually write down the question when you have it and not like try to remember it later on. All right, so hopefully what I was able to show you that what we built with Hilla is taking these off-the-shelf, standard, well-known technologies, Spring Bootlet, add just a tiny bit of magic, just the kind of bare minimum needed for making them work really nicely together, and that's what you get. If you're interested in checking it out, it has a website, it's hilla.dev, or you can use Google to search for the name. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can find me on Twitter, GitHub, LinkedIn, if you're into that kind of stuff. It's my name, so it's pretty easy to remember. You can check the schedule if you forget my name, I guess. Yeah. And that's it. Thank you so much for coming.